August 18, 1966, the monsoon is building over Phuoc Tui province. In the Long Tan rubber plantation, 2 kilometers east of the Australian base at Nui Dat, 108 men are about to face an enemy force 25 times their size. They do not know it yet, but in less than 4 hours, 18 of them will be dead, and the jungle will run red with the blood of over 245 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers. This is the story of the most desperate battle Australian forces fought in Vietnam. A battle where survival seemed impossible, where ammunition ran dry, where the rain turned the earth to mud and the sky to darkness, and where young men, some barely 20 years old, stood their ground against wave after wave of human assault. Before we begin, if you're interested in the real stories of the Vietnam War, the untold accounts, the declassified operations, and the voices history forgot, subscribe to Vietnam War Records and turn on notifications. We bring you the truth from the jungle, one story at a time. Now, let's go back to August 18, 1966. To understand how one company of Australians stopped an entire regiment. The rubber trees stand in perfect rows. Planted by the French decades before, they stretch across the plantation like soldiers at attention, their trunks grey and smooth, their canopy closing out the sky. The spacing is precise, 4 meters between each tree, enough room for a man to move, enough room for an army to hide. The ground is flat, covered in old leaves and fallen branches, no thick jungle. Just the endless rows of rubber trees disappearing into grey-green shadow. It is quiet, the kind of quiet that makes soldiers nervous, the kind of quiet that comes before contact. Major Harry Smith moves through the trees with Delta Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. He is 32 years old, a Korean War veteran, a professional soldier with a reputation for discipline and tactical precision. Behind him, 105 Australian soldiers, spread out in 2-up formation, their sections moving in staggered lines, weapons at the ready. They are tired. They missed the concert back at base. Coljoy and Little Patty were performing when they got the order to move out. Now, instead of music and cold beer, they are sweating through the afternoon heat, searching for an enemy they do not expect to find. 3 New Zealand artillerymen move with them. Captain Maury Stanley, Bombardier Willie Walker, Bombardier Murray Broomhall. They are forward observers from 161 Battery, Royal New Zealand. If contact is made, they will call in the guns. They carry radios. They carry maps. They carry the lifeline that will, in just a few hours, mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Smith does not expect action. The enemy, a heavy weapons platoon from the local D445 battalion, maybe 30 or 40 men, is thought to be long gone. The previous night, Viet Cong forces had shelled Nui Dat with mortars and recoilless rifles. 22 minutes of incoming fire. 24 Australians wounded. It was the first major attack on the base since the first Australian task force established it 2 months earlier. Bravo Company had gone out this morning to search for the mortar positions. They found the base plates. They found tracks, but no enemy. Now Delta Company is continuing the search. Operation Smithfield. Find the enemy, assess the threat, return to base. Simple. Routine. Or so they think. The soldiers of Delta Company are a mix of regulars and national servicemen, conscripts, boys who were called up, trained at Canungra Jungle Training Center in Queensland, and sent to Vietnam whether they wanted to go or not. 11 of them are national servicemen. They are 20. Some have never been in combat, but they are well trained. Every man in this company has been through Canungra, the jungle warfare school that turned raw recruits into some of the most effective counterinsurgency troops in the world. Canungra was not like American training. There were no parade grounds, no mass formations, no lectures on ideology. Canungra was the jungle, real jungle. Thick, suffocating, disorienting. Instructors, many of them veterans of the Malayan emergency, taught patrolling, ambush drills, tracking, silent movement, fire discipline. They taught soldiers to read the jungle, to move through it like ghosts, to wait for hours in ambush positions without making a sound. They taught them that firepower was useless if you could not see the enemy, that patience was a weapon, that noise got you killed. The Americans did not understand this. The Americans moved through the jungle in battalion strength, calling in airstrikes and artillery on suspected enemy positions, measuring success by body counts. They relied on firepower, on technology, on overwhelming force. The Australians relied on skill. The difference came from Malaya. From 1948 to 1960, Australian forces fought alongside the British against communist insurgents in the jungles of Malaya. It was a counter-insurgency war. Small unit actions, ambushes, patrols that lasted for days, winning the trust of the local population, cutting the insurgents off from their support. The Australians learned that you could not bomb the jungle into submission. You had to go into it. You had to be better at jungle warfare than the enemy. You had to out-track them, outweight them, outshoot them. By the time the Malayan emergency ended in 1960, the Australians had become masters of jungle warfare. They brought that expertise to Vietnam, and the Viet Cong learned, very quickly, that fighting the Australians was not the same as fighting the Americans. But on this afternoon, none of that seems to matter. Delta Company is not expecting contact. They are moving through the rubber plantation in a search pattern, looking for signs of the enemy that shelled Nui Dat. The plantation is eerie. The rows of trees create corridors, channels that seem to stretch forever. Visibility is good between the trees, but limited by the rows. You can see ahead. You can see to the sides along the rows. But beyond that, the trees close in, and distance becomes meaningless. They watch the ground for tripwires, for disturbed earth, for footprints. They listen. But there is nothing. Just the sound of their boots on the leaves, just the weight of their equipment, just the heat. At 3:40 in the afternoon, 11 platoons. It happens fast. A small group of Viet Cong, maybe 8 or 10 men moving. The Australians fire. The enemy returns fire, and when it is a brief, sharp exchange. Seconds. Then silence. Second Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, the platoon commander, is 21 years old. He is a national serviceman, an officer by training but new to combat. He reports the contact to Major Smith. Smith orders him to pursue. 11 platoon moves forward. The tracks are fresh, blood on the ground. The enemy is wounded, falling back. Sharp's men follow, 50 meters, 100 meters. They are in the trees now, moving quickly, adrenaline rising. The Viet Cong open fire from 3 sides. Not 8 men, not 10, dozens. AK-47s ripping through the trees, RPG rounds streaking through the air, exploding against the rubber trunks, sending shrapnel and splinters in every direction. Machine gun fire, heavy and sustained, tearing through the... They return fire, but they are pinned. Sharp tries to pull his men back, but the enemy is too close. They are advancing, moving in on the flanks, firing and maneuvering with discipline and coordination. These are not local guerrillas. These are main force soldiers. North Vietnamese Army, professional, trained, equipped with modern weapons, and there are hundreds of them. Smith realizes immediately what is happening. This is not a chance encounter. This is an ambush. The enemy did not flee after shelling Nui Dat. They stayed. They waited, and now they have caught Delta Company in the open, in the rubber plantation 2.5 kilometers from base. He calls for artillery support. He orders 10 platoon to move up and reinforce 11 platoon. He tries to assess the situation, but the information coming in is fragmented. Radio discipline is breaking down. Men are shouting. The sound of gunfire is constant now, a roar that drowns out everything else. And then the monsoon breaks. The rain comes down in sheets, solid, blinding, torrential, the kind of rain that turns the world grey, that soaks through uniforms in seconds, that fills the air with noise and makes radio communication almost impossible. The temperature drops, the ground turns to mud, visibility collapses, and the enemy keeps coming. They are attacking in waves now, human wave assaults. Lines of men rushing forward through the rain, firing from the hip, grenades exploding, RPGs screaming through the trees. The Australians fire back. L1A1 self-loading rifles, 7.62mm, semi-automatic, 20-round magazines. They are accurate. They are powerful, but they are not automatic. The soldiers have to aim. They have to pick their targets. They have to make every shot count, because ammunition is running low. 11 platoon is being torn apart. Gordon Sharp stands to direct artillery fire. A burst of AK-47 rounds cuts him down. He dies instantly. Sergeant Bob Buick, the platoon sergeant, takes command. He radios back to Smith. His voice is calm, professional, but the message is stark. They are taking casualties. They are running out of ammunition. They need help. Now. Smith sends 10 platoon forward. Second Lieutenant Jeff Kendall leads his men through the rain and the fire. They are moving into hell. The noise is deafening. The rain is so heavy they can barely see 10 meters. The enemy is everywhere. Kendall's men link up with what is left of 11 platoon. Together they pull back toward the company position. They carry the wounded. They leave the dead. There is no choice. The enemy is too close. Smith pulls his platoons into a tight defensive perimeter. Company headquarters in the center. The 3 rifle platoons forming a circle around it. Soldiers go to ground, finding what cover they can behind the rubber trees, in shallow depressions, in the mud. They fix bayonets. They check their ammunition. Most men have less than 1 magazine left. Some have only a handful of rounds. The M60 machine gun teams are rationing their belts, firing in short bursts, trying to make every bullet count, and the enemy keeps attacking. They come in waves. 50 men, 100 men, charging through the rain, screaming, firing, dying. The Australians cut them down. Aimed fire, disciplined fire. They shoot the leaders first. The men in front, breaking the momentum of the charge. They shoot the machine gunners, the RPG teams, the officers. They work as teams, covering each other, calling out targets, firing, reloading, firing again. The artillery is the only thing keeping them alive. Back at Nui Dat, 5 kilometers away, the gunners are working flat out. 161 Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery. 6 105mm howitzers. 103 Battery, Royal Australian Artillery. 6 more guns. 105 Battery. Another 6. And Alpha Battery, 2nd of the 35th Artillery, United States Army. 6 M109 self-propelled guns, 155mm, 24 guns in total. They are all firing. The New Zealand and Australian batteries are firing at a rate of 100 rounds per minute. The barrels are glowing hot. The gunners are loading, firing, their movements automatic, mechanical, desperate. They know that every round they fire is keeping their mates alive. Every shell that lands in the jungle is killing the enemy, breaking up their attacks, forcing them to take cover. The forward observers with Delta Company, the 3 New Zealanders, are calling in fire missions constantly. Adjust left 50. Drop 100. Fire for effect. The shells are landing within 50 meters of the Australian positions. Some are landing closer. The soldiers can hear the freight train roar of the shells passing overhead, the crump of the explosions, the screams of the wounded enemy. The artillery is walking through the enemy formations, tearing them apart, turning the rubber plantation into an abattoir, but the enemy keeps coming. The second wave, the third wave, they are trying to overrun the Australian position by sheer weight of numbers. They know the Australians are low on ammunition. They know reinforcements have not arrived. They know that if they can maintain the pressure, if they can keep attacking, the Australians will break. But the Australians do not break. Company Sergeant Major Jack Kirby moves through the perimeter, distributing ammunition, reorganizing sections, encouraging the men. He is a giant of a man, calm, unflappable, a veteran of Korea and Malaya. The soldiers call him Big Jack. He moves as if the bullets do not exist, as if the rain and the noise and the death are just another day at work. At one point, a Viet Cong machine gun team sets up less than 50 meters from the Australian perimeter. They are preparing to rake the position to suppress the defenders to allow the next wave to close in. Kirby sees them. He moves out of the perimeter, through the rain, through the fire, and kills them. All of them. Then he returns to the perimeter and continues distributing ammunition as if nothing happened. At 6 o'clock, 2 RAAF helicopters appear overhead. R-1B Iroquois, 9 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force. Flight Lieutenant Frank Riley and Flight Lieutenant Bob Grandin in the lead aircraft. Flight Lieutenant Cliff Dole and Flight Lieutenant Bruce Lane in the second. They are flying through the monsoon, through the cloud, through enemy fire. They can barely see the ground, but they know where Delta Company is. They know the company is out of ammunition. They know that without resupply the company will be overrun. The helicopters hover at treetop level. The rotors chop through the rain. The enemy fires up at them. Traces arc through the grey sky. The door gunners return fire, and the aircrew push boxes of ammunition out the boxes tumble through the air, crash through the canopy, hit the ground. Some split open, some stay intact. The soldiers scramble to retrieve them, dragging the boxes back to the perimeter, ripping them open, distributing the rounds. 7.62mm for the L1A1 rifles, belted ammunition for the M60s, grenades. The helicopters bank away and disappear into the storm. The soldiers load their weapons, and the enemy attacks again. At 6:20, Smith sends a radio message back to Nui Dat. It is terse, factual, and terrifying. Enemy could be reorganizing to attack. 2 platoons are about 75% effective. 1 platoon has been almost completely destroyed. We are reorganizing for all-round defense. The message is clear. Delta Company is on the edge. They have been fighting for nearly 3 hours. They are exhausted. They are wounded. They are surrounded, and the enemy is preparing for one final assault. At Nui Dat, Brigadier Oliver David Jackson, commander of the 1st Australian Task Force, makes a decision. He orders Alpha Company 63RR to mount up in the M113 armored personnel carriers of 3 Troop 1st APC Squadron and move out immediately. He orders Bravo Company to follow on foot. It is a desperate gamble. The APCs will have to drive through enemy-held territory through the rubber plantation, in the rain and the fading light, to reach Delta Company. If they are ambushed, if they are stopped, Delta Company will be lost. But there is no choice. The relief force moves out. 10 M113 armored, squat, tracked, angular. Each one carries a 50 caliber machine gun on top. Only 3 have armored shields for the gunners. The rest are exposed. Alpha Company soldiers crowd into the carriers. 11 men to each vehicle. The tracks churn through the mud. The engines roar. The column moves east, toward the sound of the guns, toward the artillery fire that is still pounding the plantation. The soldiers inside the carriers can hear nothing but the engine noise and the clatter of the tracks. They do not know what they are driving into. They do not know if they will arrive in time. They only know that their mates are dying, and they are going to get them out. Back in the perimeter, Delta Company waits. The rain is easing now. The monsoon is passing, but the light is fading. Dusk is coming. The soldiers peer through the gloom, watching They know it is coming. They can hear movement in the jungle, voices, equipment rattling. The enemy is massing. This will be the final assault. If it breaks through, if the perimeter collapses, it will be hand-to-hand, bayonets and rifle butts. No quarter, no surrender. The soldiers check their weapons one more time. They whisper to each other, "Good luck, mate. See you on the other side." Some of them pray. Some of them think of home. Some of them think of nothing at all. They just wait. And then, through the trees, through the rain and the smoke and the fading light, they hear it. The roar of diesel engines, the clank of tracks, the rattle of 50 caliber machine guns opening. The APCs smash through the enemy lines like hammered fists. The 50 cals rake the jungle, tearing through the trees, cutting down the Viet Cong who are forming up for the final assault. The carriers do not stop. They do not slow down. They crash through the undergrowth, through the enemy positions, into the rubber plantation, toward the beleaguered company. The enemy breaks. They scatter. They flee into the jungle, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead. The soldiers of Alpha Company dismount and form a defensive line. The enemy is gone. The jungle is silent. The rain has stopped. The only sound is the idling of the APC end. Major Harry Smith stands in the center of the perimeter, mud-soaked, hollow-eyed, alive. Around him, his soldiers are slumped against the rubber trees, too tired to move, too numb to speak. The wounded are being loaded onto the APCs. The dead are being 17 bodies laid out in a row, covered with ponchos. Gordon Sharp, the boys from 11 Platoon. National servicemen and regulars side by side, 18 in total, counting the man who will die 9 days later. 1/3 of the company, gone. Smith looks at them and feels nothing. Not yet. There will be time for grief later. Now there is only the aftermath. The smoke, the smell of blood and cordite, the knowledge that they survived. The helicopters come in after dark. 7 RAF Hughes and 1 American medevac chopper. They land one at a time, in a hastily cleared zone at the edge of the plantation, then the dead. The choppers lift off and disappear into the night. The soldiers who remain spend the night in the perimeter. They do not sleep. They listen to the artillery pounding the jungle, targeting likely enemy with drum. They listen to the sounds of the wounded enemy, crying in the darkness. They do not go after them. Not tonight. Tonight, they simply endure. At dawn, a combined force moves back into the plantation. Alpha Bravo Company, the APCs, engineers, they are going back to count the dead, to recover equipment, to see what they have done. The soldiers of Delta Company go with them. They have to. They have to find the bodies of 11 Platoon. They have to see the battlefield. They have to understand what happened. The rubber plantation is devastated. Trees shattered by artillery, craters everywhere, blood, spent cartridges, discarded equipment. And bodies, Viet Cong bodies, everywhere, sprawled in the open, piled in heaps where the artillery caught them. Some are missing limbs, some are barely recognizable. The official count will reach 245, but there are signs that many more were removed during the night. Drag marks in the mud, blood trails leading into the jungle. The enemy always took their dead. Always. It was doctrine. It denied the Australians intelligence. It denied them the satisfaction of knowing how many they had killed. But not this time. There were too many. The bodies of 11 platoon are found in their firing positions. They died where they facing the enemy. Rifles still in their hands. The rain has washed them clean. They look peaceful, almost serene. But they are dead, and they are 20 years old, and they will never go home. The soldiers recover them in silence. There is nothing to say. Nothing that matters. They wrap the bodies in ponchos and carry them to the... And then they search the battlefield for intelligence. They find weapons, hundreds of them. AK-47s, RPG launchers, heavy machine guns, recoilless rifles, mortars. Chinese manufacture. Soviet design. This was not a local force. This was a main force regiment, equipped and trained by the North Vietnamese Army, sent south to destroy the Australian task force. And they failed. They failed because 108 men stood their ground. They failed because the artillery never stopped firing. They failed because the Australians had been trained for this, had learned the lessons of Malaya, had mastered the art of jungle warfare in a way the Viet Cong did not expect. And they failed because Major Harry Smith refused to give the order to withdraw. The battle makes headlines. In Australia, in New Zealand, in the United States. 108 men against 2,500. Outnumbered 25-1, and they won. The Australian government celebrates. The military awards medals. Delta Company receives the United States Presidential Unit Citation, the only Australian unit so honored during the Vietnam War. 15 individual decorations are awarded. Harry Smith receives the Star of Gallantry, the equivalent of the Distinguished Service Order. Jack Kirby is mentioned in dispatches. The soldiers of 11 platoon are remembered as heroes, but the survivors do not feel like heroes. They feel like ghosts. They survived, and their mates did not, and there is no logic to it, no fairness, no reason. They were simply lucky. And luck is not something you celebrate. It is something you carry. The Viet Cong perspective is harder to discern. There are no official reports, no declassified documents from Hanoi that explain what the 275th Regiment was trying to achieve at Long Tan. But there are hints, fragments. In 1968, during Operation Coburg, Australian forces captured a quartermaster's notebook from the 275th Regiment. Inside were lists of casualties, names, units, dates. Long Tan is mentioned. The losses were catastrophic. 111 wounded from the regiment, an unknown number killed. The regiment was rendered combat ineffective. It did not conduct major operations in Phuoc Tay province for the rest of the war. That is the silent testimony of defeat. The enemy intended to destroy the Australian task force, to overrun Nui Dat, to drive the Australians out of the province. Instead, they were destroyed themselves, and they learned a lesson that the Americans had not yet taught them. Fighting the Australians was different. The Australians did not rely on firepower alone. They relied on discipline, on training, on endurance. They fought the jungle war the way it was meant to be fought. Up close, personal, deadly. But why? Why were the Australians so effective when the Americans, with all their resources, with all their technology, struggled to achieve decisive results? The answer lies in doctrine. The Americans fought a war of attrition. General William Westmoreland's strategy was search and destroy. Send large forces into the jungle, locate the enemy, fix them in place, and destroy them with overwhelming firepower. The metric of success was the body count. How many enemy killed? How many tons of bombs dropped? How many artillery rounds fired? It was a strategy designed for conventional warfare, for set-piece battles, for an enemy that would stand and fight. But the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army did not fight that way. They avoided contact with large American forces. They attacked at times and places of their choosing. They blended into the pot. They used the jungle as cover and concealment. And when the Americans came looking for them, they simply melted away, only to reappear somewhere else. The American strategy killed enormous numbers of enemy soldiers. But it did not win the war, because the enemy could replace their losses. Because the population turned against the Americans, alienated by the civilian casualties, by the destruction, by the arrogance of foreign soldiers who did not understand their country. And because the jungle favored the defender, not the attacker, the Australians fought. They had learned in Malaya that counterinsurgency required patience, discipline, and cultural sensitivity. They did not conduct search and destroy operations. They conducted area domination. Small patrols, operating for days at a time, learning the terrain, tracking the enemy, setting ambushes. They did not measure success by body counts. They measured it by control. Could they move freely in an area? Could the local population live without fear of them? Could they disrupt enemy supply lines and base areas? If the answer was no, they adjusted their tactics. The Australians also understood that firepower was a tool, not a strategy. They used artillery when they needed it, as they did at Long Tan, but they did not rely on it. They relied on their soldiers, on their ability to move through the jungle on their ability to read the terrain, to interpret signs, to anticipate the enemy's movements, on their marksmanship, their fire discipline, their willingness to close with the enemy and destroy them at close range. These were skills that took time to develop. The Australians had that time. They had the institutional memory of Malaya. They had the jungle training center at Kanungra. They had professional NCOs who had fought in Korea, in Malaya, in Borneo. They knew what they were doing, and the enemy knew it too. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, that after Long Tan, captured Viet Cong soldiers told their interrogators that they had made a mistake. They thought the Australians were as poorly trained as the Americans. They thought they could overrun the position with human wave attacks, the same tactics that had worked against the South Vietnamese army. They were wrong. The Australians did not panic. They did not break. They did not waste ammunition. They fought like veterans, and many of them were not. They were national servicemen, boys who had been drafted, who had been in Vietnam for a matter of weeks, but they had been trained, and that training saved their lives. This is the lesson of Long Tan. Training matters. Doctrine matters. Understanding the nature of the war you are fighting matters. The Americans never fully learned that lesson in Vietnam. They continued to rely on firepower, on technology, on the belief that superior resources would eventually wear down the enemy. And they were wrong. The war ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon, and the North Vietnamese won. Not because they had better weapons or more soldiers, but because they were willing to endure, to adapt, to fight a protracted war of attrition that the Americans could not sustain politically. For the Australians, Long Tan became a symbol. It was their Gallipoli, their defining moment, the battle that encapsulated everything they believed about courage, mateship, and sacrifice. Every year on August 18th, Vietnam Veterans Day, Australians remember Long Tan. They remember the 108 men who fought there. They remember the 18 who died. They remember the artillery, the relief force, the helicopter pilots, the New Zealand gunners. They remember that, for a few hours on a rainy afternoon in a rubber plantation in South Vietnam, a company of Australian soldiers stood against impossible odds and won. But they also remember the cost, the trauma, the wounds, physical and psychological, that the survivors carried for the rest of their lives. Many of the men who fought at Long Tan never spoke about it. They came home to a country that was divided over the war, that did not want to hear their stories, that called them baby killers and warmongers. They buried their memories. They tried to move on, but Long Tan stayed with them. It always stayed. Major Harry Smith retired from the army as a lieutenant colonel. He spent decades advocating for greater recognition for the men of Delta Company, arguing that some of them deserved higher awards, that their actions had been undervalued by a military and political establishment that wanted to forget about Vietnam. He was angry. Not bitter, but angry, because he knew what his men had done. He knew how close they had come to being, and he knew that history, if it remembered Long Tan at all, would sanitize it, would turn it into a neat narrative of heroism and victory, and would forget the terror, the chaos, the luck. In interviews late in his life, Smith was blunt. He said that Long Tan was a very close thing. He said that without the artillery, without the relief force, Delta Company would have been destroyed. He said that the soldiers fought magnificently, but that they were also lucky. Lucky that the APCs arrived when they did. Lucky that the monsoon disrupted the enemy's final assault. Lucky that the artillery never stopped firing. And he said that Gordon Sharp, the young platoon commander who died in the opening minutes of the battle, deserved more recognition than he received. Sharp was 21, a national serviceman. He stood to direct artillery fire, and the enemy cut him down. And Smith, believed he deserved the Victoria Cross. He never received it. Smith died in 2023, aged 90, still fighting for his men. The artillery deserves its own recognition. 5 kilometers away from the battle, the gunners could not see what was happening. They relied entirely on the forward observers, on the radio messages crackling through the static, on the map coordinates and the fire missions. They worked in teams, loading, firing, loading, firing. The guns were so hot that the paint blistered off the barrels. The crews worked through the rain, through the noise, through their own fear. They knew that every shell they fired was keeping their mates alive, and they did not stop. For 3.5 hours, they maintained a rate of fire that was, by any standard, extraordinary. Over 3,000 rounds fired, 100 rounds per minute at the peak. The New Zealand gunners of 161 Battery were particularly praised for their accuracy. They walked the artillery fire through the enemy formations, adjusting constantly based on the reports from the forward observers, dropping shells within 50 meters of the Australian positions. This was danger close fire, the kind of fire that requires absolute trust between the infantry and the artillery, because a mistake, a miscalculation, a wrong grid reference, and you are killing your own men. But there were no mistakes. The artillery was flawless, and it was the artillery, more than anything else, that won the battle. The helicopter crews who flew the ammunition resupply also deserve recognition. Flying through a monsoon, through enemy fire, hovering at treetop level in a UH-1B Iroquois, which is not a stable platform at the best of times, takes courage. The pilots could barely see the ground. They were relying on radio guidance, on guesswork, on hope. And they had to hover. Not land, hover, because there was no landing zone. Just the jungle canopy and the rubber tree. The door gunners returned fire, tried to suppress the enemy, but they were outmatched. The crew chiefs pushed the ammunition boxes out, and then they got out of there, banking hard, dropping low, disappearing into the storm. One of the pilots, Frank Riley, said later that it was the most terrifying thing he ever did in Vietnam, not because of the enemy fire, because of the weather, because he could not see, because one wrong move, one gust of wind, and the helicopter would have crashed into the trees. But he did it. They all did it, because they knew that without that ammunition, Delta Company was finished. The relief force, too. 105 soldiers of Alpha Company, crammed into 10 armored personnel carriers, driving through enemy territory, through the rubber plantation, toward the sound of battle. The APCs were not invulnerable. An RPG could disable one. A mine could blow the tracks off. If the column was ambushed, if it was stopped, Alpha Company would have been fighting for their own lives, not rescuing Delta Company. But the gamble paid off. The APCs smashed through the enemy positions, their 50-caliber machine guns raking the jungle, breaking the enemy's final assault. The soldiers of Alpha Company dismounted and formed a defensive line, ready to continue the fight if necessary. But it was not necessary. The enemy was broken. They had lost hundreds of men. Their regiment was shattered, and they knew now that the Australians were not going to be an easy target. The 1st Australian Task Force was there to stay, and Phuoc Tuy Province was going to be contested fiercely for the next 5 years. The legacy of Long Tan is complex. On one hand, it is a story of courage and professionalism, of soldiers doing their duty under impossible circumstances, of training and discipline overcoming numerical superiority. It is a story that Australians are justly proud of. On the other hand, it is a story of a small battle in a war that Australia lost, a war that achieved nothing, a war that tore Australian society apart and left thousands of veterans traumatized and abandoned. Long Tan did not change the outcome of the Vietnam War. It did not prevent the fall of Saigon. It did not vindicate the decision to send Australian troops to fight in a foreign civil war on the other side of the world. What it did do was demonstrate that Australian soldiers, when properly trained and led, were among the best in the world. And that is not nothing. That is something worth remembering. But it is also worth remembering the cost. 18 dead, 24 wounded, hundreds of enemy soldiers killed. For what? To hold a rubber plantation for a few hours? To prevent an attack on Nui Dat that may or may not have been coming? To prove that the Australians could fight? It was a tactical victory. But in the broader context of the war, it was meaningless. The war ground on for another 9 years. 58,000 Americans died. 522 Australians died. Millions of Vietnamese died. And in the end, the North won, the South fell, and the whole exercise was revealed as a tragic waste. So what do we take from Long Tan? What is the lesson? Perhaps it is this: that soldiers do not fight for grand strategies or political ideologies. They fight for each other, for the man next to them in the perimeter, for the mate who is wounded and needs to be carried out, for the memory of the friend who died. The soldiers of Delta Company did not fight at Long Tan because they believed in the domino theory or because they wanted to stop communism. They fought because they were there, because they were surrounded, because the alternative was death or capture. They fought because Major Smith told them to, because Jack Kirby moved among them and kept them steady, because the artillery was firing and the helicopters were coming and there was somewhere in the chaos and the terror a sliver of hope. And they survived, some of them, not all, never all. And that is the tragedy of war. That courage and skill and training are not enough. That luck matters. That fate matters. That you can do everything right and still, or you could do everything wrong and still live. And there is no fairness in it, no justice, just survival. The Battle of Long Tan ended at 7 o'clock on the evening of August 18, 1966. The rain stopped, the enemy withdrew. The survivors looked at each other across the muddy perimeter and realized they were still alive. Some of them cried, some of them laughed, some of them said nothing at all. They had been to the edge, and they had come back, and there were no words for what that meant. In the days that followed, the battle was analyzed, debated, but for the men who fought it, Long Tan was not a story. It was not history. It was a scar, a memory that would not fade. The smell of the rain and the cordite, the sound of the artillery, the faces of the dead. They carried it with them for the rest of their lives. And when they died, old men in their beds, far from the jungle, far from the rubber trees, they carried it with them into the darkness. Because that is what war does. It takes everything, and it gives nothing back. Today, there is a cross at Long Tan, a simple wooden cross, replaced over the years, maintained by veterans and volunteers. It stands in the rubber plantation, now overgrown, the trees older and thicker, the ground reclaimed by the jungle. The cross marks the place where 11 platoon made their stand, where 18 Australians fell. Every year, on Vietnam Veterans Day, Australians remember. They lay wreaths. They observe a minute of silence. They tell the story of Long Tan to a new generation, to people who were not born when the battle was fought, who have no memory of the Vietnam War, who cannot understand what it was like. But they try, because Long Tan matters. Not because it was a great victory, not because it changed the war, but because it revealed something essential about the capacity to endure, to stand when every instinct says to fight when defeat seems certain, to survive when survival seems impossible. The 108 men of Delta Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, and the 3 New Zealanders who fought with them did that. They stood, they fought, they survived. And that is enough, because there is nothing more. If you want to hear more real stories from the Vietnam War, stories that the history books left out, stories that honor the voices of those who were there, subscribe to Vietnam War Records. We bring you the truth from the jungle. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover the history the world forgot. Thank you for watching. Remember Long Tan. Remember the 108, and never forget the cost of war.